Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mary Klopman, Dean of the School of Medicine and Vice Chancellor for Health Affairs. I'd like to welcome everyone to this town hall to discuss children and COVID-19 vaccines. Last week, the CDC gave final approval for use of the Pfizer COVID vaccine for children ages 5 to 11. This is exciting news for 28 million children in the US in this age group. This comes after the FDA granted emergency use for the vaccine for children, and CDC Director Rochelle Walensky signed off on using the vaccine in children following a 14-0 vote in favor of the agency's Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices. Still, we know that many parents have questions. I'm excited to welcome our expert panelists to address some of those questions today. Dr. Susanna Nagy, Vice Dean for Clinical Research and Associate Professor of Medicine, Dr. Geeta Swamy, Vice Dean for Scientific Integrity and Professor of Obstetrics and Gynecology, Dr. Chip Walters, Professor of Pediatrics, and Dr. Kanisha Zimmerman, Associate Professor of Pediatrics. If you have additional questions, please use the QA feature at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try to get to many of them at the end of this session, but if time runs out, then we will address them to you in some other forum. If needed, a live transcript of this event is now available as an option within Zoom, and it may be turned on or off by selecting the closed caption or live transcript option from the menu at the bottom of your screen. A recording of the town hall will be available on the School of Medicine website. So now let's get started. So Chip, you're both a practicing pediatrician, but you're also a clinical investigator, and you've participated in the trials that enrolled children. So fortunately, very few children get severe illness with COVID. So do they really need to be vaccinated?
Well, thanks, Mary, first for the opportunity to participate in the panel discussion today. As you know, I've been really involved with the studies this year, particularly for the COVID vaccine in children. The simple and quick answer to your question is yes, children really do need to be vaccinated for a number of reasons. And first and foremost, it's the best way to protect children from infection. And not only infection, but complications of infection. What you point out is true that adults and older adults are really disproportionately affected by more severe illness, but children still can have, severe illness and complications. So, what we've seen with the recent Delta wave is that there's been an increasing proportion of cases of COVID are occurring in children up to about 25%. And as expected, this has been accompanied by an alarming increase in the number of children that have been hospitalized during this particular last Delta wave. To date, there have been about 700 deaths in children 18 years of age and older. And I'd just like to point out that that's about 7 times the number of deaths that you typically would expect during a flu season or a typical flu season. The other thing is the complications, the one that we really worry a lot about is this inflammatory condition that can occur after COVID, which is called multi-system inflammatory syndrome. And this is where children get inflammation of their organs. It can occur around the heart and the lungs, in the kidneys, in the GI tract, and a number of different organs become affected, and children can become quite ill and be hospitalized. And to date, there have been about 5,000 cases or more of MIS, or this inflammatory condition in children, and about 48 deaths in children due to that. That's really the first, protecting your children. The other thing that we have to realize is that children can spread COVID to other people. They can spread it to their family members. They can spread it to their grandparents, older adults, and people who are immune compromised. And that vaccination is one of the best ways we have to prevent the spread, other than potentially masking. Another component of that is that children and adolescents make up a good proportion of the population, about 20%. So if we want to reach that herd immunity level, which is estimated to be about 85% or more with COVID, you really do need to vaccinate children. They're an important part of the population. And then the last point I think I'd like to make is that children's lives have really been disrupted this past year and a half. School was interrupted for a long period of time. Normal social activities have been disrupted, and it's really had a significant impact on the health and mental health of children. So it's really the last reason, and probably one of the most important, to get children vaccinated.
Well, most importantly, you all have children, so you've been through that. So you are living this experience. So can you walk us through how it was actually studied? What did the clinical trial look like?
Yeah, well, thanks. So the trial was done in two components. The first component, which we call phase one, was really where we tested three different dose levels of the vaccine. So we tested the vaccine starting with the lowest dose for this age group. It's 10 micrograms, which the 30 micrograms is the adult dose. So this is was a third of the dose. We then went and tested 20 micrograms and also 30 micrograms. And based on the side effects we saw with the three different doses, particularly the 30 microgram dose where we saw a fair amount of fever, and even in the 20 microgram dose, and the level of protection in a really small group of people, children, this was really, quite a small group. It was decided that the best dose for children this age between 5 and 11 to really evaluate further was the 10 microgram dose, or that third of the adult dose. So then from there, you've tested the vaccine, the smaller dose of the vaccine, in the second phase of the study in about 4,500 children. Children were randomized 2-to-1 to receive either 2 doses of the 10 microgram dose versus the placebo. So roughly about 3,300 children receive vaccine and 1,500 receive placebo. From there, the parents were then asked to report symptoms for 7 days following each dose of vaccine, and that's pretty typical for vaccine studies. And the side effects in the children were then compared to those in adults. And what we saw is that, children, because their arms are a little bit smaller than adults, tended to have a little bit more redness and swelling at the injection site. They actually reported less pain, and they actually also had fewer systemic side effects like fever, headache, chills, and muscle aches, and than the older adolescents and young adults. We also obtained blood samples from the children to measure their levels of neutralizing antibody, which really measures the level of protection in their blood. And these levels were then compared again to the group of people that were 16 to about 25 years of age who received the 30 microgram dose, the full adult dose, in the adult trial and adolescent trial. And what we saw there was that the level of protection in the children was really actually as good as a level of protection in the older adolescents and adults. And this is called an immunobridging study. So we bridged the results from the children to those of adults who we knew had levels of protection from infection from the adult study. And that's commonly done in vaccine studies. What was a little bit unusual, and that we maybe didn't expect in this trial because it was done quickly in a smaller group, is that we would be able to see how effective that the vaccine was. And unfortunately, we were doing this trial during the COVID Delta wave, which hit, and it was unfortunate that that occurred, but we actually did see a level of protection in the children, so that it showed that the vaccine was 90% effective, with 16 children in the placebo group getting COVID and three in the vaccine group. And again, none of the children actually got serious infection. So the children are continuing to be monitored. We'll monitor them for up to 2 years. And then in this particular study, we're still evaluating children at younger ages, under 5 years of age. So the study that's been done to date has been 5 to 11. We're now studying children under 5 all the way down to 6 months of age, and we're evaluating the 3 microgram dose, or an even lower dose, which is the 10th of the adult dose.
So thanks, Chip. So Susanna, with that background on the clinical trial, can you walk us through the process of FDA authorization and CDC recommendation, and specifically in the end, what was recommended?
Yeah, so I mean, and I think people have seen this. I think it's been amazing to kind of watch how much of the process is now known by the lay public, because it gets reported on, every step of the way. But the first step is obviously for the company to get sufficient data to submit to the FDA, which is the regulatory body that has to approve a new drug or vaccine to be able to roll out into the clinical space. And I think we'll talk a little bit later about the difference between authorization versus a full approval. In this case, because we are in an emergency, national emergency setting, we need to get these things out more rapidly than would be through the typical approval. And so the companies are submitting data that they, and I should say, are in a lot of conversation all along the way with the FDA to know that they are going to meet those, requirements for the FDA. And there are documents that the FDA has put out to industry, both to meet the level for EUA and to meet the level for full approvals. So that data is submitted. The FDA turns this around very, very quickly because we are in a national emergency. So generally they post the review dates within 30 days, which I think is exceptional and not typical for a common pathway for approval of a drug or vaccine that isn't in the middle of a national emergency. And then the FDA, like the CDC, which we'll talk about, have essentially unbiased review committees that are advisory to the FDA. And they review the data. And these are largely representatives from academics. So, for example, Dr. Swami is on the VRBP, which is the vaccine and biologic products committee that basically reviews all of the data. Here's the sponsor present these. And then ultimately votes, as you mentioned, and makes that recommendation as an advisory group to the FDA. The FDA then ultimately has to make a decision on whether or not they're going to authorize. And again, they did authorize, in this case, the Pfizer vaccine at 10 micrograms as a 2-shot series separated by 3 weeks. So that is required to then be able to consider whether that can roll out into clinical practice and can be accessible. The next step is really from the clinical practice perspective, and that's where the CDC comes in. So the CDC has their own separate advisory, which is the ACIP, as you mentioned, and Dr. Walter has also sat on the ACIP. So we have good representation here, and Geeta maybe too, I don't know, at some point in her time. So that's the advisory that really looks at the clinical utility of a vaccine, right? And really weighs risk and benefit, weighs the correct and the appropriate populations, the timing, the doses, et cetera. Usually these track very closely with what FDA may authorize or approve, but they may also add additional populations and make other considerations. And again, in this case, the ACIP made the unanimous decision, I believe, to recommend this in clinical practice. And then again, they're an advisory group. So ultimately it is the director of the CDC who signs off on that. That allows that recommendation now to make it into kind of the table that we as clinicians all review for recommendations on who gets vaccines and when. And that really helps with ensuring insurance will approve these once they are approved, fully approved and all of that. And then also really gives that access to clinicians to begin rolling that out into the clinic. And that's the path that this took. And I frankly, happened relatively quickly once the data was sufficient to get in.
And Susanna, you might remind everybody what is the difference between emergency use authorization and the full FDA process?
Yeah. So in terms of that, this is, again, in an EUA, this is, at least in my career, this is not something that we see happening regularly, right? So this is a via many government acts and laws that say that the federal government, the FDA and the CDC can do these sorts of things under very, very unique national emergency situations. So if you look and compare what the FDA sets as a bare minimum, if you will, for approval for a COVID vaccine, a full approval for a COVID vaccine, it is that they would want data on at least 3,000 people who have been dosed with active vaccine. and at least 6 months of follow-up from that last dose, so end of series, for safety. And that's the requirement for full approval. And of course, there's lots that goes into like the product and all that, the chemistry and things. So for the EUAs, the data that you've seen come forth, and actually Chip mentioned this, was that they reviewed data on over 2,000 kids, just shy of 2,000, I think it was, that had active. And then they actually added, and that was with 2 months of follow-up. So not 6, but 2. So it's a little bit shorter in the follow-up period. And then they actually added additional numbers of vaccinated kids who had about 2.5 weeks of follow-up. So the general difference is that for the vaccines, it was a little bit of a shorter follow-up period, maybe smaller numbers overall, but there's still the same requirements as it relates to all the other pieces. And I think the weighing of the risk and benefit is a really critical piece in the EUA and making a determination. So there are differences. I think some people worry that these things happen so fast. And I think that's the one thing I like to remind people of, is that pre-COVID, pre-national emergency, the FDA has very clear pathways and very clear ways of identifying drugs or biologic products that should move much more quickly. What I say is it's less about cutting corners on safety. It's more about cutting the red tape of how quickly it would otherwise take the FDA to review something. It allows these vaccines or COVID-related drugs to skip the line, if you will, and move forward more quickly because of the life-saving potential for these. So some differences, but I wouldn't consider them to be major. And I think when you think from a vaccine perspective, what difference does 2 months of data for safety versus 6, when we think of more of these severe reactions from vaccines to happen, quite frankly, within the first couple of weeks.
So let's talk about the practical side of this. So we have 2 practicing pediatricians, Kanisha and Chip. I'm going to run through some questions that I'm sure you will be facing as you discuss with parents. So just, if I walked in and said, Dr. Zimmerman, how safe is this vaccine?
It's very safe. I think, Chip gave us a little bit of information, or a lot of information actually, about the process. And Susanna gave us some information about what the FDA had to go through in order to make sure that it met the criteria. What a parent can actually expect when their kid goes in, when my kid went in, is maybe a little bit of arm soreness, a little bit of swelling on the arm, but otherwise maybe a little tiredness and a headache. But I didn't even know, for example, that my kid had gotten vaccinated. I wouldn't have known if I hadn't taken him myself. So it really is, and he's had, now a week of vaccination and has done really, really well with that. But the data are there and really, really reassuring.
So Chip, I'm a parent, and I come in and I say, I've been reading about this heart inflammation. Is that something I should be concerned about?
Yeah, I mean, I think this has probably been the most talked about side effect from the mRNA COVID vaccines, of which the Pfizer vaccine is one. The other being the Moderna vaccine, which isn't for use in children at this age or anybody under the age of 18 at this point. So the side effect is myocarditis and pericarditis, myocarditis being inflammation of the heart muscle and pericarditis being inflammation of the lining around the heart. And they have been reported following both mRNA COVID vaccines, and both the Pfizer and Moderna vaccine. What we do know about it is that this side effect seems to occur more commonly in young males, and it's usually following the second dose of vaccine. And if you're looking at the rates, there was a study done out in the Kaiser system, which looked at the rate following second doses of COVID vaccine and showed that the rate was about 5 cases per million second doses. So that's a pretty small, or not real common occurrences. Now, if you look at the group of males that are between 12 and 29 years of age, that rate actually bumps up, and it's been reported, and these aren't confirmed cases, but this was reported through the CDC's vaccine adverse event reporting system. That rate is about 40 per million second doses in that group of males that age. It's really important to remember, though, that this side effect, myocarditis or pericarditis, is easily recognized if it does occur, and it's really easily treated, and generally fairly mild, although I think for some people would be alarming. It's also important to remember that myocarditis occurs following COVID and following that inflammatory condition that I talked about. In those cases, myocarditis is much more severe than the myocarditis that we see following COVID vaccination. So, and the last thing, I think for kids this age, I think it's really difficult to extrapolate what we saw in adults or young adults and the adolescents down to this age for two reasons. One, the younger kids are getting a lower dose of vaccine. And the other thing is that this condition, to me, was seen more commonly in males. And I don't think we still have a good explanation for that other than potentially it being hormonal. And so if you're talking young kids, I don't think that they're going to have that particular influence. That would just be my thoughts on that. I don't know that we know that to be exactly true. But I don't think we can extrapolate what we've seen in adults down to kids. And it's also important to remember that both the FDA and the CDC really carefully weighed all the information about myocarditis. And it was determined that the benefits when looking at disease and myocarditis occurring after infection and with MISC, the benefits far outweigh the risk from vaccination. So.
Just to round out the safety discussion, there is a question about what was the most severe complication documented in the children that did participate age 5 through 11?
The most severe thing we saw, and this was really with the higher doses, was fever. And then we did see a few serious adverse events, but they were not related to vaccination at all. I think broken arm was one, and I'm not remembering what the other was, but they were not at all related to vaccination.
Thanks. So getting back to your families that come in, Kanisha, what if a parent comes in and says their child had documented COVID infection a couple of weeks ago? What would you advise them in terms of vaccination?
I would absolutely advise you to still get vaccinated. There's so much we don't know about how long the protection will actually last if you have natural immunity or natural infection versus having a vaccine. There was a recent study suggesting that for people who had been vaccinated versus those who had been naturally immunized or who had disease, those who had disease had twice the likelihood of getting reinfected compared to those who had been vaccinated. So we think that vaccines likely give way better coverage, definitely more sure coverage than what we know or what we think we may know associated with having the disease.
So just to finish the safety discussion, are there long-term registries now being set up as there were for adults to follow what might happen months out from vaccination? Chip, you want to take that?
Well, I'll just chime in. I think, we have to remember that all the children are in the studies anyway are being followed for 2 years or 2-year time period. So that's one way. I mean, I think in terms of registries, I am not familiar that there are any ongoing registries. Susanna, do you have any?
I mean, I wouldn't say registries, but as you said, I mean, the follow-up for these studies are ongoing. And remember, I mean, the ultimate goal for these drugs are to be fully FDA approved. And so that follow-up will continue. I think, how many additional kids end up enrolled in other ways to further understand this. Obviously, the Moderna vaccine program is ongoing in children. So I think, between the 2 mRNA vaccines, we'll see a lot. What I will say is that in my review, the vaccine adverse event reporting system, that over 200,000 kids under the age of 12, I'm gonna say that again, over 200,000 children under the age of 12 through the vaccine adverse event reporting system have been vaccinated with an mRNA vaccine. These are likely people who convinced someone to vaccinate their child before the vaccine was approved. And over 100,000 are fully vaccinated. So over 200,000 have gotten their first dose. And reporting from that, there's about, I think, close to 1,000 kids that age had some adverse event reported. It's very much as Chip described: fever, headache, and fatigue. So nothing severe that's been reported there. And I quite frankly was shocked to hear the number of kids that have been reported to be vaccinated outside of the trials and outside of the EUA that's come through recently.
Yeah, I hadn't heard that number. So that's interesting. Yeah.
I will say there's, the CDC has the vaccine safety data link, which in the Kaiser system, which will really be able to be utilized to look at some of those concerns that parents may have about any long-term side effects, but we won't be able to do that for quite some time. So, but I'm sure those things will be being monitored, and the VSD has done work like that over the last 2 decades. So they'll continue to monitor safety of vaccines.
So Chip and Kanisha, are there any kids that shouldn't be vaccinated?
Yeah, really, there are very few children that I can think that should not be vaccinated. Very few. If you look at the package insert, the only people that shouldn't get vaccinated is somebody who's had a severe allergic reaction after a prior dose. Obviously, that wouldn't be their first dose. It would be their second dose of vaccine. And, in that case, if you think your child had an allergic reaction, then you really should talk to your child's provider to confirm that that's what that is. And then if somebody had an allergic reaction to an ingredient in the vaccine, the one that I can think of potentially is polyethylene glycol.
Yeah.
And that's a substance or chemical, or that's commonly in a common ingredient in Miralax, which is a common stool softener used in kids. Then there are a few precautions that maybe should be realized, and this is really an exceedingly small number of kids. A child who or adult who may have had a case of myocarditis, it's not recommended after vaccination, not myocarditis as earlier on, but after vaccination should not get a second dose. And then there's very little data if somebody had that inflammatory condition, whether they should get another vaccine, so that multi-system inflammatory condition. And in that case, probably, they should have a discussion with their provider, what the risks and benefits are. They clearly need to be recovered, and it's really recommended that it not be within 90 days of diagnosis. And then the last things that I might consider for deferring vaccination for a while, obviously, if a child has an active febrile illness, I would probably not vaccinate that child at that time. I would defer it for a few days until they feel better. And then the last thing
you might explain a little bit why, because I think people might think that that's because it's a safety issue.
I don't think it's a safety issue as much as if a child has a fever and then they go in and get another vaccine, which could cause a fever, then you just compound that. And I think that's just good vaccination practice in general. We generally don't like to give vaccines to children who have a febrile illness. If they have a minor cold and it's resolving, then that's okay. Then the other group would be somebody who's gotten monoclonal, and this probably doesn't extend to a lot of kids, but somebody who's gotten monoclonals to treat COVID, they should be deferred for a 90-day period.
So a couple other questions have come up in the chat around whether there's any information as to whether the vaccine has any effect on long COVID in kids. There is that question in adults with some data. I suspect no data in kids yet.
I am not aware of any data in kids. There are reports of long COVID in kids and adolescents, but I don't know that, I really don't know that it's been systematically studied in any way that I've seen any good information. There are those anecdotal reports in adults that they improve with vaccination after if they have long symptoms from COVID, but I don't know of anything in children.
So Gita, there's been so much misinformation about a relationship between vaccination and infertility in adults. And now I'm hearing that in children. Can you address that?
Yeah, well, I mean, the simple answer is there's no association between the vaccine and fertility concerns or issues. The reality is that, we're dealing with, for those of us here on the screen who've been working in vaccines for quite some time, we've dealt with a misinformation campaign for years about all kinds of things related to vaccines. But at the same time, we need to take those concerns seriously. We need to talk to our patients, our employees, our peers and whatnot to understand why they are thinking this, why are they feeling this, to really try to get to the issue. The misinformation that was put out there, or even the sort of theoretical question, was about specific to mRNA vaccines and whether they were, there was a sort of overlap of antibody that's generated by vaccines to the spike protein on the virus, and whether that had some overlap with a protein in the placenta. It doesn't. That has been debunked. There's no reason to raise concern about that. There's nothing about adolescents and certainly children that would be different about their overall development or going through puberty or any of those sort of things that a vaccine would have an interference with. And quite frankly, we certainly know that the impact of infection, high fevers and so forth, can certainly have longer term health consequences. And as Chip said, even though we're not seeing severe disease in children, I think that ultimately we are going to find out a lot more about long COVID and what the long-term implications of those are. So we'll have to see where that falls.
And you can use this opportunity to reiterate the safety and actually the protection during pregnancy.
Yeah, thanks. It's something that is that we keep pushing on now, and we have. I just was quoted. I need to keep pulling up that quote and make a bumper sticker out of it that says, pregnant women were sort of pushed to the edge at the beginning and not included in trials, and then people say, well, we can't give you the vaccine because you weren't included in trials. So it can't be both ways. And the reality is that the vaccine has now been given to, I'd say, hundreds of thousands of pregnant women, which is well beyond any number we would have studied in a trial, right? Like in a trial, the most we might have had for, say, a phase 2 subpopulation, than say just the masses would have been maybe 3,000 to 10,000. And we have data on probably at least 500,000, 500,000 pregnant women at this point. There is no concern whatsoever about vaccination for the pregnant person themselves versus their developing fetus. And quite frankly, we have really disturbing data about the impact of COVID on maternal health and on fetal health. You probably have seen there have been, mounting data from particularly states with low vaccination uptake, where we've seen high incidence of pregnant people being admitted to the ICU. We're going to have amazing data, sadly, about the use of ECMO during pregnancy because of so many pregnant people being on ECMO in the ICU, and also seeing a high incidence of stillbirth or fetal death from pregnant people with COVID infection. So hands down, the infection is worse for the pregnant person and for the fetus and for an infant born to the pregnant person, even if does okay, and certainly if born early, than anything that there would be concerns raised about the vaccine.
So this can be for any of you. I think it's probably more of an opinion, but if you had a child that's within a couple of months of turning 12, would you recommend their parents wait so they get the full adult dose or take the pediatric dose? Susanna?
I think we've all had this question from a number of people and colleagues. I think this is actually one that is very real because we have kids that are changing age very soon, and in fact there's a slide set from the presentation at the CDC addressing this specifically. So I think the recommendation is follow the age at which your child is, and the sooner they can get access to the vaccine, the better. So if they're 11 today, they should get the dose consistent with an 11-year-old. And when they turn 12, then they could get the dose consistent with a 12-year-old. So I think that is the way that this should be currently done. That's what the CDC is recommending. Chip, I don't know if you had something else to add there.
No, I would just echo what you just said to say that they should get the dose for the age at which it's recommended and not wait. I think there's a risk in waiting, and I really feel confident that the 10 microgram dose will protect them very well. So I don't worry about that at all. I did have one follow-up question for Gita. Was that information on pregnant women from the BSafe system?
So in VSafe, Chip, there's data now. I think it's around 200,000 pregnant women who have enrolled in VSafe. But obviously, if you then extrapolate from how many people have not enrolled in VSafe, right, and look at the data across, like from Israel and the UK, right, it's so many more pregnant women. So not just US data. At this point, there are estimates, although I would venture a guess to say it's a little hard when we talk about the number of pregnant women vaccinated, because that's always changing, right? It's only a finite time that someone is pregnant. And so the general estimates have ranged somewhere around 25 to 30% of pregnant people are vaccinated. So, but as far as the poor outcomes, yeah, that's coming from data from CDC that's been published, and not the stillbirths and so forth, but some of the data that's been coming out of other states, particularly from their health departments and so forth.
I will say the VSafe system is, for people that don't know, is the CDC system for following people after vaccination, and it's all done through text messages. I signed up after I got my vaccination. But I talked to several people who've had their children vaccinated, and it hasn't been offered at that time. So that is something I think that would be very useful to do, and useful information to gather on a larger number of kids. So
yeah, in that VSafe registry, right? Those are the people who just signed up, but of that, they're following specifically about 6,000 pregnant people to get the outcomes of their infants as well.
So Kanisha, many of our families have kids 5 and under, and then they have a 10-year-old. What precautions would you recommend to those families that are still going to have young kids that are not vaccinated?
Right. I mean, the best thing is to get all the people in your house who can actually be vaccinated. That's the first thing, for sure, because that will be the best protection that we can have. Continuing to do things like distancing, wearing masks, washing hands, all the things that you're doing now for your 10-year-old and for your family, you should continue to do to make sure that you can protect those who are younger. There certainly the 0 to 4 is a reasonably high risk group when you're looking at across age groups and who requires hospitalization or ED visits. Certainly those are the people that we have seen a lot in the ICUs when we're thinking about who's at risk. So continuing to do the things that you had done before is what the recommendations are.
So I have a couple of practical pediatrician questions. Kids might not want that shot, whether it's COVID or any other shot. Have you seen good strategies to put kids at, relax and not be so anxious about getting a shot in the arm?
Chip might be able to answer this better because he's dealt with it in the trial, but I will say I would talk to your kid. I have been very surprised at the number of kids who want this shot. They have, there's been so much that has impaired their ability to kind of be a kid, go to school normally, do all of their things, and lots of conversation about it, and they're listening to all of it. I would encourage you, my son was excited and asked me when he could actually be fully vaccinated. What does that mean, Mom? When can I actually do that? So I think we are finding that they're a little bit more excited about this shot than they have been about prior shots. Chip?
Yeah, I think we haven't had too many people that were too frightened of the vaccine. I think, obviously we're doing this in a study situation here where we're drawing blood and doing nasal swabs and doing vaccinations all in one visit. So we're doing a lot with the children that's procedure oriented, and a lot of them are a little anxious about that. We do some things to lessen that. Actually, we had in the clinic for a while, we had a dog that came in for kind of like pet therapy with the kids to kind of relax some of them. Things you can do to distract kids are great. We've had some parents come in with a device called Buzzy, which is a cool vibrating device. You'd kind of chill it, and you put it on the arm prior to vaccination and then pull it up, and that can kind of decrease some of the pain and maybe a little bit distracting. Having them play games around the time may be another distraction as well. So I think and then also a lot of times just the nurse talking to kids through the vaccine, and a lot of them are just experienced at doing it and can distract the kids. So
What do you think, Gita?
Well, I was going to ask a question, Chip, about, multiple vaccines. I still remember taking my kids in when they were so tiny, and you lay them down and put all those shots in their thighs. And I was always like, oh, that's hurting me to watch that. But I'm thinking about it from co-administration. Has there been, I just didn't see it, the recommendation even in kids, because a lot of these kids would be coming in for standard vaccinations, right, that they might need. So I'm wondering, has there been looked at that? Because obviously in adults, you can give COVID vaccine with another inactivated vaccine at the same time.
Right. Well, the recommendations from the CDC are that COVID vaccine can be given alongside with other vaccines at the same time. So that is the current recommendation. That said, at this point, there's really not a lot of data around co-administration. One of the few studies that I'm aware of was in older adults with getting high-dose flu vaccine, and it showed it to be safe and that it worked well. We actually are doing a co-administration study here in adults getting flu vaccine currently with mRNA COVID vaccines, and that's a CDC study. And then we will be looking at children getting other vaccines that are co-administered with their COVID vaccine and following those children in the practices. But there really isn't a lot of data. I think this is one of those situations where you balance a couple things, because we want to get a lot of children didn't get vaccinated for a period of time during the beginning of the COVID pandemic. So we kind of lost time, and some of them are behind on their schedule. I think we're trying to catch those kids up, and that's really important to do. And so that's the reason for allowing co-administration. I think if your child's caught up on their vaccines and you don't feel comfortable, it's probably okay to space them out by a week or so.
And looking into the future, do you think we are going to be recommending boosters for kids, or this is going to be an annual vaccine? What do you think?
Right now it hasn't been studied in children to date. I think, part of it's the crystal ball and where we'll be with the pandemic, and where will the need be, and what's the risk and benefit rate, of getting vaccinated again. So I think those are all things that we have to stay tuned for. I can say that to date, as I said, we haven't studied boosters in adolescents. I think that is on the radar right now and probably will be done. So the next age group that'll be evaluated will probably be those adolescents 12 to 15. And I suspect if the need continues, and this is going to be an annual or every other year vaccination, that we probably will do similar studies in children. So.
And there are a couple of questions, again, getting at this issue of natural or immunity from infection versus vaccination. And, we have a few adult studies, one that's a little bit contradictory, but would everybody like to weigh in on that? If your child had COVID, how much benefit do you think you would get from vaccination?
Yeah, I'm happy to start with that. I mean, I think, again, we don't have a lot of data in children, right? And in fact, except for the, because we're just rolling these out in kids. So anything that we say is going to be extrapolated from what we know in adults. And I think Kanisha mentioned the trial that did not show as broad a coverage in one study from the CDC, but I think we do have other studies that have suggested that natural immunity can be quite broad. I mean, it is different in terms of the immune response that you see from natural infection versus from a vaccine. But I think, as Kanisha said, the variability is broad. So that is one of the issues, is that when you get a vaccine, we have a very good understanding of the range of the response. It tends to be very high. And although it can wane over time, as we see with any vaccine, frankly. With the natural immunity, as you will, as Kanisha referred to it, from natural infection, it's just quite variable. So I think that's the concern, right? Is you just don't know what you're getting. What looks more convincing, in fact, is that if you get vaccinated after having had infection, versus the full vaccine, a vaccine series after, you do appear to have very broad and longer lasting immunities. I think this really argues to the point of, sure, you may be protected from natural immunity, but the variability is you don't know where you stand, you don't know how long that will last, and you don't know how protective that is. And because of the safety of vaccines, the vaccine on top of that appears to be excellent compared, and probably better than compared to a vaccine series alone. So frankly, I think that data still argues for the idea of getting a vaccine after infection. And I guess the whole point of, well, why not just get infected and have natural immunity? My response to that is the number of people that you would have to see die to achieve the level of immunity that we can get from vaccines, in my opinion, would be unacceptable.
I think the other thing I was going to add is that, the other part is we don't know what we don't know. We don't know what variant is coming downstream next week. We don't know when we start to see this become, more of endemic, like let's hope that's where we're getting to. Then our eyes kind of off it for a while. And then we see people coming in with illness, and is it cold? Is it RSV? So it's all of those things that we have to not be looking at just right now. Are you protected now, right? Because we don't generally in the vaccine world think about, I just need to protect you for the next few weeks, right? This is the long-term game here that we want to talk about. So it's really about longer-term prevention as well. And if we really want to get to a point of reducing overall, as Susanna pointed out, the terrible outcomes, the mortality, but to reduce the transmission, we need to get to where everyone has the best level of immunity they can have. So that we can reduce also that asymptomatic, disease that they might have to then spread. So.
And then ending on looking what's coming, Chip, you mentioned that the under 5 group is being looked at currently. When are you anticipating that there will be vaccination recommendations for under 5? And then also, what about Moderna and what about J&J?
Yeah, so I'll field some of those questions there. So there's a lot wrapped into that. So the pediatric Pfizer study is ongoing for the kids under 5. We have enrolled part of the cohorts, but there's the older cohort, actually the children 5 to 11. Initially, we started out with one group, as Susanna pointed out. And then the FDA actually asked that more children be included in the study. So, we're doing the same in the younger children. So we initially started with one group of children in both the ages under 5. So it's done in 2 different groups, 2 to 5-year-olds and 6-month to 2-year-olds. And as you can imagine, immunizing and technically just studying children in the age range of 6 months to 24 months is much more difficult, just with blood drawing and all the things that you have to do. So it's taking a little bit longer. I suspect that we may see data pretty soon in the 2 to 4-year-olds or up to 5-year-olds. That may take a little bit longer in the youngest age group. I don't know how that they're both getting the same dose of vaccine. I'm not quite sure how that will be forthcoming to the FDA. We're submitting data in an ongoing fashion, but I'm not sure whether their application will be divided into, they'll apply for children 2 and up, or at the same time as they apply for children 6 months to 2, or whether they'll kind of separate it. So I don't quite have the time frame. I suspect that we'll see something for at least some of those kids early in the next year, or late December, early next year. For the Moderna study, that the adolescents have been studied, and that data is with the FDA. I don't know exactly, they're still reviewing it, and it seems like that has taken quite a bit of time for them to review. And I know the study in younger kids under 12 is ongoing. So.
Okay, well, I was fielding a lot of questions as you all were answering them, so we got to cover almost everything. I do want to remind everybody that their children can be vaccinated at Duke. You go to the dukehealth.org/COVID-19 vaccine scheduling, but also your pediatricians most likely have access now, and pharmacies. So lots of different ways to get your kids vaccinated. Any closing comments from any of you? I know, Susanna, your kids participated in the trial. Kanisha, you mentioned your son got vaccinated.
Mine are vaccinated. They went in, I went in on day 2 that Duke was offering it over at the Carr Center. So they got to see the new alumni building and they were excited. So.
And I'm waiting for my grandchildren to be vaccinated.
Oh, well, I have
I
have a pregnant daughter-in-law, and I go to Geet all the time to say, well, should she get boosted? And the answer is yes. So I would encourage everybody on this in this conversation to use us and to continue to ask us questions. You can send them to me directly or schoolofmedicine@duke.edu. And we'll be glad to get the experts to weigh in. So with that, thanks to the panel, and thanks for everybody that tuned in today, and everybody take care of themselves.
Bye.